In 1968, when Harlem was alive with political fervor, economic struggle, and deep-rooted loyalty, a hitman named Johnny the Blade DiCarlo made a decision that would seal his fate. He believed that with a $250,000 payday, he could betray one of Harlem's most powerful figures, Bumpy Johnson, and walk away unscathed. What Johnny didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson wasn't a man who could be easily fooled. Betrayal in Bumpy's world was a dangerous game, and Johnny soon learned that playing it would cost him more than he could imagine. In just 72 hours, the hitman who had crossed Bumpy would be found in a box, his body mutilated and his eyes gone. The chilling outcome would send a message to anyone who thought they could play with fire and escape unscathed. This is the story of how Johnny the Blade DiCarlo, in his greed and arrogance, crossed a line that should never have been touched, and how the streets of Harlem would never forget the price of betrayal. Johnny the Blade DiCarlo was a hitman who thought himself untouchable. With dark, slicked-back hair, a chiseled jawline, and an icy stare that sent a chill through anyone who crossed his path, Johnny had made a name for himself as one of the most feared killers for hire. He was known for his precision, his cold-hearted efficiency, and his ability to move through the underworld without leaving a trace. Johnny operated in the shadows, taking jobs for anyone who could afford him, whether they were street gangs or corrupt businessmen. He wasn't loyal to anyone. He was a mercenary, driven by money, power, and the thrill of the kill. But there was one thing he underestimated. Harlem's kingpin, Bumpy Johnson, had a code that didn't allow for betrayal, especially when it came to his family, his people, and his empire. Bumpy's reputation was built on respect, loyalty, and justice. He had worked tirelessly to build an empire that protected the streets of Harlem from outside forces. To betray Bumpy, to play him for a fool, was a line that no one should have crossed. But Johnny, in his arrogance and desire for a quick payday, decided that Bumpy was just another target. The job was simple: kidnap Bumpy's close associate, a trusted confidant, and hold him for ransom. Johnny was promised $250,000, but he didn't know that this wasn't just about money. It was about something much deeper, something far more personal. As Johnny made his plans, he thought he was in control. He was wrong. Johnny's plan wasn't just about money, it was a direct challenge to Bumpy's authority. By targeting one of Bumpy's closest allies, Johnny had made a mistake that would cost him everything. The hitman believed that Bumpy would pay the ransom, that he would come to terms and negotiate, but what Johnny failed to realize was that Bumpy didn't negotiate. He protected what was his, and anyone who threatened that would pay the price. Johnny had crossed a line that few men ever survived. The streets of Harlem were Bumpy's domain, and when you went after a piece of his kingdom, there were no second chances. It wasn't just about getting the ransom money back. It was about restoring the balance and sending a message to anyone else who thought they could challenge Bumpy's power. Bumpy Johnson had worked his way through life with honor, loyalty, and respect. He had built a reputation that was untouchable. But when you attacked his people, when you betrayed his trust, there was only one way it ended, and Johnny had just made that mistake. The stakes were high. Johnny had threatened not just Bumpy's business, but the very principles that kept Harlem streets alive. And now, Bumpy was going to make him pay. The next 72 hours would be filled with tension as Bumpy's men moved to bring justice to the streets. In Bumpy's world, betrayal never went unpunished. The plan had seemed foolproof. Johnny and his crew had successfully abducted Bumpy's associate, taking him to a safe house where they kept him locked away, hidden from the world. Johnny was confident. He had the upper hand, The ransom money was already promised, and he was just biding his time until Bumpy paid. But Bumpy wasn't one to be dictated to. His network of informants was vast, his reach far beyond what Johnny could comprehend. The moment the kidnapping took place, Bumpy was already making his move. His men were on the ground, quietly tracking every move, gathering every scrap of information. By the time Johnny realized that Bumpy wasn't going to negotiate, it was too late. He had underestimated the man he was dealing with. Bumpy's reaction was measured, calculated. He didn't waste time with threats or emotional outbursts. He simply gathered his resources, organized his men, and set the stage for Johnny's downfall. Bumpy wasn't in a hurry. He knew that justice would come in its own time, and when it did, it would be swift and final. Johnny had no idea that his fate had already been sealed. He thought he had control, but Bumpy was always 3 steps ahead. Bumpy's response to the news of the kidnapping was cold, but his mind was already working. His men knew exactly where to find Johnny and his crew, but Bumpy was careful. He didn't need to rush in with guns blazing. He needed to make sure that when the time came, Johnny would understand the cost of his betrayal. Bumpy was a man of few words, but when he spoke, it was always calculated. "In this life, you have 2 choices," he said to his men. "You can take what's yours, or you can take from someone who's worked for it. Johnny took from me, and now he'll learn what happens when you steal from the wrong man." His tone was calm, but there was an undercurrent of absolute certainty. There would be no mercy. Johnny had crossed the line, and now it was time for Bumpy to show him the consequences. Bumpy wasn't going to let his associate be taken without paying the price. For Bumpy, this wasn't just about the money. It was about sending a message. The people of Harlem had learned to respect him, and that respect came with a price for those who dared betray it. Johnny's false sense of security was palpable. The days dragged on, and the hitman believed he had the upper hand. He was preparing to collect his money, believing Bumpy would cave and hand over the ransom. But what he didn't know was that Bumpy had already set his plan in motion. Bumpy's men were closing in, positioning themselves in places where Johnny would never see them. They watched his every move, waited for him to slip up. They knew when Johnny would try to move his hostage, and they knew where to find him when the time came. It was the 4th night after the kidnapping, and Johnny was starting to feel uneasy. The ransom money hadn't arrived yet, but he believed it was only a matter of time. His crew had started to relax, thinking they had the situation under control. But as the clock ticked on, the tension in the air grew thick. Johnny had no idea that Bumpy's men were already in position, closing in on him with each passing hour. Johnny and his men had gathered at a small, run-down safe house on the outskirts of Harlem. The place was quiet, abandoned even. But as the hours passed, a feeling of dread began to settle over Johnny. His gut told him something was wrong. At exactly 10:30 p.m., just as Johnny was getting comfortable, a noise interrupted the stillness, a faint sound of footsteps. He stiffened, eyes darting toward the door, but before he could react, the door burst open. Bumpy's men flooded into the room with an almost eerie calm, blocking every exit. Johnny's crew reached for their weapons, but the cold steel of Bumpy's enforcers was faster, more precise. Within seconds, the room was silent, save for the rustling of bodies as Johnny found himself surrounded. Then, standing in the doorway, Bumpy Johnson walked in. His presence was overwhelming, his calm demeanor belying the power that exuded from him. The room fell into silence once again. Johnny, still trying to hold on to his bravado, stood and took a step toward Bumpy. "You think you can just come here and—" Before he could finish his sentence, Bumpy's sharp eyes cut him off. "No, Johnny, you think you can come into my world, take what's mine, and walk away free? Well, now you know what happens when you try to cross me." Johnny's eyes widened as realization struck him like a fist. His hand instinctively reached for his gun, but Bumpy was already steps ahead. Bumpy's men had him pinned down, the weapon in his hand easily disarmed. The hitman's bravado melted away. "Please, Bumpy, I didn't mean to cross you," Johnny stammered, his voice faltering. "It was just business. I didn't know this would happen." Bumpy stepped closer, his cold gaze never leaving Johnny. "Business?" Bumpy repeated with a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You killed one of my family, and you think it's just business? No, Johnny, it was a mistake, and now you'll pay for it." Johnny's face drained of color as the gravity of Bumpy's words sank in. He began to beg, but Bumpy was beyond mercy. The punishment had already been decided. In the blink of an eye, Bumpy's men had moved with precision, and the hitman was incapacitated. Johnny was no longer the confident, untouchable man who had believed he could play both sides of the game. He was now just a pawn in Bumpy's hands, and his fate was sealed. Johnny was taken to a darkened warehouse, a place that Bumpy used to keep his most important business dealings. The lights flickered above, casting long shadows over the cold concrete floor as Bumpy stood over Johnny, calmly assessing the situation. "I told you once," Bumpy said, his voice as calm as ever. "There's no coming back from betrayal." The hitman, still trembling, could barely hold his gaze. His pleading became frantic, but it was too late. Bumpy's men, loyal to the end, carried out the punishment. It wasn't quick, nor was it merciful. Johnny was left to suffer the consequences of his greed and his betrayal. The aftermath was clear. Johnny was found 2 days later in a box, his body disfigured and his eyes taken. Bumpy's message was undeniable. Betrayal had consequences, and anyone who crossed him would face a similar fate. As the news spread through Harlem, there was no fear. The people who had once been at the mercy of the hitman's reign of terror now found peace, knowing that justice had been served. Bumpy had once again restored order to his streets, showing that there was no room for those who disrespected his family and his community. The streets of Harlem hummed with the kind of energy that only comes after a storm has passed. Johnny the Blade. DeCarlo's death was a sobering reminder to anyone who thought they could break the unwritten rules of Harlem and get away with it. His dismembered body, his eyes gone, told a story that was as old as the streets themselves. Betrayal was met with swift retribution. For Bumpy, the aftermath wasn't about revenge. It was about maintaining the balance. He had already lost one of his closest friends to the hitman's treachery, and now the scales had been righted. The people of Harlem knew that their king would always protect them. They knew that Bumpy was the embodiment of loyalty, and anyone who threatened that would pay. Bumpy's legend grew even more that day, not just as a feared gangster, but as a protector, a leader who valued loyalty above all else. His decision to take Johnny's eyes was a symbol, a stark message that would be whispered on the streets for years to come. No one was above the law of respect. For Johnny's men, the message was clear. Stay loyal or be prepared to face the consequences. Harlem streets had a new standard of justice, and anyone who dared challenge Bumpy's reign would suffer the same fate as the hitman. If this story hit you, smash that subscribe button. We're telling the Bumpy Johnson stories that history forgot, the moments that made him a legend, the code that made him untouchable. Drop a like if you think Bumpy was the smartest man in Harlem. And in the comments, tell me, what would you have done if you were Bumpy? Would you have let Johnny get away with betraying your people, or would you have done what he did? More legendary stories coming next. Don't miss it.